July 6, 1944. Normandy. 10:14 a.m. A German scout peers through Zeiss 7x50 binoculars. He sees an American M4 Sherman tank idling near a hedgerow. The tank is positioned poorly. It's exposed. The German signals his anti-tank gunner. A 75mm round screams across the field. It impacts the Sherman's turret. There is no explosion. There is no shriek of tearing metal. There is a pop. The 30-ton war machine deflates like a birthday balloon. The turret sags. The gun barrel droops. The German gunner freezes. He hasn't killed a tank. He has killed a bag of air. The men operating that tank weren't tankers. They were artists. And the generals in Washington had spent the last 6 months mocking them. They called this unit the Rubber Army. They called it a traveling circus. The standard M4 Sherman weighed 66,800 pounds. It had 76 millimeters of frontal armor. This tank weighed 93 pounds. It had 2 millimeters of neoprene-coated fabric. It could be punctured by a stray twig. It offered zero protection. But for the next year, 1,100 men would use these 93-pound balloons to hold off 40,000 Germans. This is the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The Ghost Army. They were a tactical deception unit, the first of its kind in U.S. Army history. The table of organization was unique. 105 men, 82 officers. Their primary weapon was not the M1 Garand or the Browning .50 caliber. It was the compressor. It was the paintbrush. It was the 500-pound wire recorder. While the rest of the army was learning to shoot, these men were learning to lie. Their mission was simple: impersonate a force 30 times their size. The unit was a composite force. It mashed together 4 distinct disciplines. First, the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. These were the visual liars. Many were recruited from art schools like Pratt and Cooper Union in New York. They sketched the decoys. Then, the 32nd Signal Service Company. The sonic liars. They handled the audio deception. Third, the Signal Company Special. The radio liars. They spoofed the airwaves. Finally, the 406th Combat Engineers. They provided perimeter security. They were the only ones using real bulldozers. The mockery started at Camp Forest, Tennessee. January 1944. The 23rd began training with their pneumatic battalion. Regular infantry marched past the training grounds. They saw men inflating rubber trucks. They saw tanks bouncing when they hit a bump. The insults were constant. The balloon squad. The blow-up brigade. Colonel Harry L. Reeder, the commander, took the heat. He knew the numbers. A real armored division requires 15,000 men and 3,000 vehicles. Reeder had to simulate that volume with 1,000 men and a few hundred inflatables. The technology was crude, but specific. The inflatable M4 was designed by the United States Rubber Company. It came in a canvas bag the size of a golf bag. It had a skeletal framework of steel tubes. The skin was rubberized canvas. It took a 3-man crew 20 minutes to inflate one tank using a portable air compressor. But the flaw was the weight. A gust of wind over 20 miles per hour would pick up a 30-ton tank and flip it over. Nothing ruins a deception faster than a tank doing a backflip. May 1944. The unit ships out to England. The skepticism follows them. General Patton favored aggression, not trickery. The prevailing doctrine was firepower. Deception was seen as a British parlor game, not an American tactic. The 23rd was kept top secret. Not even their families knew what they did. They simply said they were engineers. If the Germans found out, The unit was dead. They had no heavy weapons. Their half-tracks carried speakers, not quad-mount 50s. They were sitting ducks wrapped in rubber. If you want to see how a group of art students terrified the German high command, using nothing but loudspeakers and inflatable rubber, hit that like button. It helps us dig up more declassified files. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to the 23rd. The men land in France in June 1944. They are immediately thrown into the chaos of the hedgerows. The reality of war hits them. A rubber tank doesn't stop shrapnel. Their first major test comes in August. Operation Elephant. The objective: cover the movement of the 2nd Armored Division. The 2nd Armored, hell on wheels, was leaving a sector near the forest of Cerisy. The 23rd had to move in and pretend to be the 2nd Armored. They had to hold the line visually and sonically. The ratio was absurd. One Ghost Army soldier had to simulate the presence of 30 real soldiers. If the Germans realized the 2nd Armored was gone, they would punch a hole right through the line. The deception required forensic attention to detail. It wasn't just about parking rubber tanks in a field. It was about sewing. The 603rd Engineers spent hours painting the correct bumper markings on their Jeeps. They sewed the Hell on Wheels patches onto their uniforms. They even mimicked the way the 2nd Armored wore their helmets. They drove their trucks in loops. A convoy of 2 trucks would circle a block 20 times. To a German observer, it looked like a column of 40 trucks. The sonic deception was the most technically complex. The 3132nd Signal Service Company used wire recorders. This was cutting-edge tech in 1944. A spool of thin steel wire, miles long, recorded magnetic impulses. The recording unit weighed 500 pounds. They had recorded sounds at Fort Knox, tanks on gravel, tanks on mud, tanks idling, bridges being built. They didn't just play noise, they mixed it. They had a library of sound effects they could layer to match the terrain. These sounds were blasted through 500-watt amplifiers mounted on M3 half-tracks. These were called heaters. The speakers were massive. They could project sound up to 15 miles. On the night of Operation Elephant, the 23rd positioned the heaters on the flanks. They pointed them at the German lines. At 10 o'clock p.m., they hit play. The sound of a heavy armored column echoed through the French night. Squeaky treads, revving engines, voices shouting commands. The German reaction was immediate. Their listening posts picked up the noise. They triangulated the sound. It sounded exactly like the 2nd Armored Division was settling in for the night. The German artillery began to fire. They shelled the coordinates of the noise. They wasted hundreds of rounds of high-explosive ammunition. They were shelling empty fields and speakers. Meanwhile, the real 2nd Armored Division was 30 miles away, flanking the enemy. The deception worked, but the success brought new dangers. The 23rd was now a magnet for artillery. That was their job. Draw fire. It is a terrifying order for a man armed only with a carbine. During Operation Elephant, a shell landed near a deception site. Shrapnel tore through the inflatables. Men scrambled with patch kits and glue. They had to repair the tanks before the sun came up. A deflated tank at dawn would give away the entire game. Brest, August 25, 1944. The unit moves to the port city of Brest. The task is to simulate a massive buildup on the flanks to draw German reserves away from the center. The 603rd sets up dummy artillery batteries. These were made of plywood and fabric. From 500 yards, they looked lethal. From 50 yards, they looked like stage props. To sell the lie, they used flash canisters, small charges of black powder set to detonate on a timer. At dusk, the show began. The soundtracks played the roar of 105mm howitzers, The flash canisters detonated, creating the visual muzzle flash. The Germans bought it. Their observation posts reported heavy artillery concentrations on the flanks. The German commander shifted his reserves to meet the phantom threat. The real American attack smashed through the weakened center. The rubber army had just manipulated the tactical map of a major battle. The technical fetish of the unit extended to the radio operators. The signal company special. These men were hand-picked for their fist. Every telegraph operator has a unique rhythm when tapping Morse code. It's like a fingerprint. The Germans had excellent signals intelligence. They knew the fist of the operators in the real divisions. If the 23rd wanted to impersonate the 6th Armored, they couldn't just send the right codes. They had to tap the keys exactly like the guys in the 6th Armored. They practiced for hours. They analyzed recordings of the real operators. They mimicked their mistakes. They copied their slang. When the 23rd took over a radio net, the German listeners heard the same rhythm, the same speed, and the same idiosyncrasies they had been tracking for weeks. It was identity theft on an industrial scale. The Germans logged the traffic and moved their pins on the map accordingly. They were moving pins based on a lie. September 1944. The weather turns. This was the enemy of the inflatable. Cold air causes air pressure to drop. The tanks would go soft at night. The barrels would droop. Viagra for Shermans didn't exist. The crews had to wake up every 2 hours to top off the pressure. Rain weighed down the fabric, causing the turrets to sag. The deception required 24-hour maintenance. One sagging barrel could reveal the hoax to a German plane. The unit moved to Luxembourg, the Bettembourg Gap. This was a critical defensive line. The 6th Cavalry was pulling out. The 23rd had to cover a 7-mile front. 7 miles. 100 men. If the Germans attacked here, they would walk right through to Luxembourg City. The commander of the 6th Cavalry looked at the inflatable tanks and shook his head. "You're going to get slaughtered," he said. He left. The ghosts stayed. This operation relied on atmosphere. The 23rd sent their trucks back and forth to the rear, but they didn't drive empty. They put 2 men in the back of every truck, instructed to look bored. This simulated a troop rotation. They went to the local bars. They ordered drinks. They loudly complained about the colonel of the 6th making them dig foxholes. They knew there were German spies in the bars. Loose lips sink ships. But in this case, loose lips built armies. The proximity to the enemy was terrifying. At Bettembourg, the German lines were 2,000 yards away. German patrols probed the lines at night. The Ghost Army sentries were terrified. They had .30 caliber carbines. If a German patrol found a tank that bounced, they would radio back. The barrage would be instantaneous. The men slept in their foxholes with their boots on. They knew they were bluffing a hand with no cards. The physics of sound became a life-or-death calculation. The sonic teams had to account for thermal layering. In the morning, cold air sits near the ground. Sound travels further and clearer. At midday, heat rises, carrying sound up and away. They had to adjust the volume of the heaters based on the time of day. Too loud, and it sounds fake. Too quiet, and the Germans don't hear it. They were audio engineers in a combat zone. They started using spoof visual tracks. A real tank churns up the mud. An inflatable tank sits on top of the grass. It looks like it floated there. So, the 406th Combat Engineers used their bulldozers. They carved up the earth where the fake tanks were positioned. They created mud tracks leading up to the inflatables. They smashed fences. They knocked over small trees. They landscaped the battlefield to match the weight of the ghosts. November 1944. The mud is deep. The 23rd is exhausted. They have been running non-stop since June. They are the gypsy soldiers. They have no permanent home. They move where the line is weak. The stress is unique. A regular soldier fears death. A ghost soldier fears discovery and death. If the deception fails, they have failed the men they are covering. The psychological burden is heavy. They are professional liars, and the lie must be perfect every time. The Maginot Line. December 1944. The 23rd is tasked with simulating a crossing of the Meuse River. They need to make the Germans believe the attack is coming at a specific bridgehead. The sonic company sets up near the riverbank. They play the sounds of pontoon bridge construction, hammering, saws, the clanking of metal, men shouting, "Heave!" The Germans react. They fire flares. They fire mortars at the bridge. The bridge didn't exist. The sounds were coming from speakers hidden in the trees. But the Germans committed forces to stop it. They moved artillery into position to shell a ghost bridge. Meanwhile, 10 miles south, the real engineers were building a real bridge in silence. The 23rd absorbed the punishment intended for the real crossing. Every shell that landed on a speaker was a shell that didn't land on a combat engineer. Intelligence reports captured after the war confirmed the success. German maps from this period show the 6th Armored Division located exactly where the Ghost Army was. The German High Command estimated the American strength in that sector at 8,000 men and 150 tanks. The actual strength was roughly 8 men and 0 tanks. The Ghost Army wasn't just fooling the field commanders. They were fooling the intelligence analysts in Berlin. The Battle of the Bulge. December 16th, 1944. The German offensive catches everyone by surprise. The chaos is total. The Ghost Army is in Luxembourg City. They are in the path of the offensive. For the first time, their deception is useless. You can't trick a panzer division that is rolling over you. The unit is ordered to scramble. They pack up the rubber tanks. They become regular infantry for a few days, manning roadblocks. They realize how undergunned they really are. During the retreat, the fragility of their equipment becomes a liability. A truck full of inflatable tanks looks suspicious if it gets hit. They have to hide the bodies. If the Germans capture a truckload of rubber Shermans, the secret is out. They have orders to destroy the equipment rather than let it be captured. They carry thermite grenades specifically for melting the sonic equipment. The wire recorders contain the secrets of the American Army's sound signature. January 1945. The bulge is contained. The Allies push into Germany. The 23rd is back in business. But the terrain changes. Germany is different from France. The civilians are hostile. The risk of spies is higher. Setup times must be faster. They develop a quick deploy method. They can inflate a dummy tank in 15 minutes now. They don't use the electric compressors. They use the exhaust from the jeeps. It's faster, but it melts the valves if they aren't careful. The visuals evolve. They introduce the dummy L4. The L4 Grasshopper was a small observation plane. The 603rd built fake ones. They placed them in open fields. To a German commander, seeing L4s meant American artillery spotters were in the area. It meant an attack was imminent. The Germans would hold their fire to avoid revealing their positions to the planes. The Ghost Army used fake planes to suppress real flak. The integration with the real army remained difficult. A colonel from the 90th Infantry Division drove past a Ghost Army position. He saw a tank parked in the open. He screamed at the soldier, Get that damn tank under cover! The soldier saluted and lifted the tank with one hand to move it. The colonel was speechless. He drove away without saying a word. The secrecy was so tight that even American field commanders didn't know who these guys were. The art of camouflage is not just about hiding, it's about revealing. The 23rd learned to leave things purposefully bad. They would camouflage a dummy tank, but leave the corner of the net loose. They wanted the German scout to find it. If the camouflage was too perfect, the German would see nothing. If it was slightly imperfect, the German would think, "Aha, I found a hidden tank." He would report a tank. The deception relied on the enemy's ego. The sonic projection had limitations. It couldn't simulate the ground vibration. A real column of tanks shakes the earth. A speaker does not. So, the 23rd operated mostly at distances over 1,000 yards. At that range, the ground tremor dissipates. But at close range, the gig was up. They had to ensure no German patrol got within the vibration zone. The security perimeter, the 406th Combat Engineers, had the hardest job. They had to stop patrols without creating a massive firefight that would draw attention. February 1945. The Meuse River. Operation Grenade. The 23rd is tasked with a massive display. They need to simulate the buildup of the 9th Army. They deploy 200 dummy vehicles. They run the sonic heaters for 48 hours straight. The wire warms up. The amplifiers overheat. The men work in shifts, swapping out tubes and wires. It's an endurance test. The sound of engines becomes a drone that drives the men mad. They can't sleep. The noise is constant. The Germans respond with heavy mortars. They pound the deception area. The 23rd takes casualties. Private First Class. Arthur Singer, later a famous artist, sketches the scene. Men huddled in foxholes, while loudspeakers blare the sound of a bridge construction that isn't happening. The absurdity is peak forensic history. Men dying to protect a speaker system. The flash units. The 23rd developed a device to simulate artillery fire at night. It wasn't just a flash, it was a sequence. A small pop, the primer. A large flash, the propellant. And then the sound, the boom. Light travels faster than sound. They had to synchronize the flash with the sonic delay on the speakers. If the sound arrived before the flash, the physics were wrong. The Germans would know. They used stopwatches to time the delay based on the distance to the German lines. March 1945. The Rhine. This is the big barrier. The Germans are dug in on the east bank. Eisenhower needs to cross. The 23rd is called up for their masterpiece, Operation Viersen. The plan is to fake a crossing at Viersen to draw the German army north, allowing the real crossing at Wiesel. This will be the largest deception of the war. Every trick they learned in the hedgerows of Normandy will be used here. The scale is massive. They need to simulate 2 full infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th. This requires thousands of vehicles. They don't have thousands of inflatables. They have 600. They have to use them like stage props. They place them in the front. In the rear, they use trucks driving in circles. They use the atmosphere teams to fill the radio waves with thousands of fake orders. The radio deception for Viersen was scripted like a movie. They wrote a 20-page script for the radio operators. They created fictional characters. Captain Smith, who always complained about his Jeep. Sergeant Jones, who was looking for lost rations. They played out these dramas on the unsecured radio nets. The Germans were listening. They heard the chatter of an army preparing for a massive assault. They heard the stress. They heard the logistics. The Germans bought it. They began moving their heavy panzer units north toward Viersen. They stripped the defenses at Wiesel. The 23rd was watching this happen. They saw the dust clouds of German columns moving toward them. It was a moment of terrifying validation. The plan was working, which meant the 23rd was about to be the target of the entire German defense on the Rhine. The inflatable decoys were upgraded for Viersen. They used real logs to cover the tanks. They used real empty shell casings scattered around the artillery. They piled up empty ration boxes. The garbage of an army is hard to fake. You have to physically scatter trash. The 23rd spent days literally trashing the German countryside to make it look like 30,000 men were camping there. The sonic plan for Viersen utilized the river acoustics. Water carries sound. The 3100 Umtor second placed their heaters right at the water's edge. They aimed them across the Rhine. They played the sounds of amphibious trucks, DUKWs, entering the water. The splash. The distinct engine note of a DKW. The Germans on the other side heard the invasion fleet launching. They fired into the dark water. They killed nothing but fish. Visual feedback. American reconnaissance planes flew over the Viersen sector. They took photos. The 23rd analyzed their own camouflage. If it looked fake from the air, they fixed it. They were their own harshest critics. They noticed that real tracks looked different in the morning dew than in the afternoon sun. They adjusted their bulldozing schedule to match the optimal viewing time for German spotter planes. The tension of the lie. During Viersen, the men of the 23rd knew that if the Germans called the bluff, there was no retreat. The Rhine was behind them, or rather, to their flank. They were pinned. Colonel Reeder slept with his pistol. The officers checked the perimeter hourly. The line between a successful deception and a massacre is razor thin. The climax of Part 1 approaches. The stage is set at the Rhine. The Germans have moved their reserves. The real Ninth Army is silently moving into position at Wiesel, 10 miles south. The 23rd is making as much noise as possible. They are the Matador's red cape. The bull is charging. The specifics of the rubber army's arsenal by 1945. They had 500 inflatable tanks, 200 inflatable trucks, 100 inflatable artillery pieces, 12 distinct sonic soundtracks, 25 radio nets, and 100 exhausted men. They were running on caffeine and adrenaline. The Viersen operation would be their final exam. The impact on the German command structure. Field Marshal Kesselring was reacting to reports that didn't make sense. Why is the American 30th Division at Viersen? They were at Malmedy yesterday. The 23rd's radio spoofs explained the movement. Rapid redeployment. They filled in the logic gaps for the Germans. They answered the questions before the Germans could ask them. The cost of rubber. The Goodyear and U.S. rubber companies produced these decoys. The cost was $50 per tank. A real tank cost $50,000. The economic asymmetry was staggering. For the price of one real tank, the Army could deploy 1,000 fake ones, but the generals had to trust them. That was the hard part. As the sun set on March 23, 1945, the bombardment began. Not the American bombardment, the German one. They opened up on the Viersen sector with everything they had. Rockets, heavy artillery. They were trying to smash the buildup before it crossed the river. The 23rd huddled in their bunkers. The ground shook. Miles south, at Wiesel, the silence was broken. The real Ninth Army launched their boats. They crossed the Rhine with minimal resistance. The German guns were pointed at Viersen. The German reserves were rushing to Viersen. The Ninth Army established a bridgehead in hours. Casualties were light. Churchill crossed the river the next day. He should have thanked the artists. The aftermath of Viersen. The 23rd surveyed the damage. Their army was shredded. Dozens of inflatable tanks were destroyed. The fields were cratered. If those shells had hit real tanks, the loss of equipment would have been in the millions. If they had hit real men, the telegrams home would have been in the thousands. The rubber took the hit, the vindication. After Viersen, nobody laughed. The 9th Army commander sent a commendation. The deception was completely effective. The balloon squad had saved an estimated 10 to 30 American lives by drawing fire and diverting enemy strength. The mockers fell silent. The artists had gone to war and won. But the war wasn't over, and the 23rd wasn't done. As they moved deeper into Germany, the mission changed. They weren't just fooling the army, they were fooling the nation. But the fatigue was setting in. The ghost soldiers were starting to feel like ghosts themselves, existing only to be shot at. Part 2 will cover the final days. The legacy. The secrets kept for 50 years, and the specific lives of the men like Bill Blass, who went from inflating tanks to designing fashion. But for now, remember the 23rd as they were on the banks of the Rhine. A tiny unit shouting at a giant, daring it to strike. The equipment specs. The heaters used 9 tubes. The wire moved at 2 feet per second. The fidelity was 200 to 5,000 cycles. Low fidelity by modern standards, but high enough to sound like death approaching. The final count for Part 1. By March 1940, the 23rd had conducted 20 operations. They had been on the line for nearly 200 days. They had suffered casualties. They had proven that in modern war, the paintbrush is as lethal as the bayonet. The ghost concept was vindicated. The U.S. Army began rewriting its manuals on tactical deception. The Special Troops designation became a badge of honor, not a mark of shame. But the biggest secret was yet to come. The unit would be disbanded, and their records sealed. The men were told to never speak of it. They went home to their wives and said, "I blew up balloons." Their wives laughed. They didn't know their husbands had saved the 9th Army. Part 2, April 1st, 1945. The Ruhr Pocket. The German army is collapsing. But a collapsing building is dangerous. It falls on people. The 23rd is moving east. The roads are clogged with 300,000 surrendering German soldiers. This creates a new tactical problem for the ghosts. Traffic control. A convoy of inflatable tanks cannot stop. If it stops, civilians touch them. If civilians touch them, the illusion breaks. The 23rd had to drive their rubber M4s at 15 mph non-stop through villages filled with enemy eyes. The visual deception trucks carried a specific loadout. 12 inflatable tanks per truck, 4 air compressors, 20 gallons of eau de green paint. But in April 1945, they started carrying something else. Souvenir Lugers. The discipline began to fray. The war was ending. The men knew it. But the command kept issuing orders. The 23rd was tasked with simulating the 75th Infantry Division. They had to hold a sector near the Dortmund-Ems Canal. The distance to the enemy was 800 yards. At 08:00 a.m. on April 3rd, a German reconnaissance plane flew low. A Focke-Wulf 190. It strafed the Ghost Army position. The 20mm cannon shells hit a fuel dump. The dump was made of empty oil drums and cardboard. It didn't explode. It didn't burn. It just splintered. The pilot circled back. He was confused. He fired again. Nothing. He radioed base. Americans have fuel that does not burn. The intelligence report was filed. The Germans concluded it was a trap. They refused to attack the sector. The sonic teams faced a different threat: wear and tear. The wire recorders had been running for 10 months. The steel wire, 0.04 inches thick, was brittle. If the wire snapped during a broadcast, the sound of a tank column would instantly turn into a high-pitched shriek. It happened twice near Kassel. The sonic crews had to splice the wire in the dark, under fire, with pliers and tape. A splice took 3 minutes. For 3 minutes, the army went silent. The psychology of the ghost soldier changed. They were no longer the underdogs. They were the masters of the battlefield. They walked with a swagger. They wore the patches of the divisions they were impersonating. They went into towns and demanded surrender. A sergeant from the 603rd, wearing a stolen colonel's eagle, accepted the surrender of a German town mayor. He had no authority. He had no troops. He had a jeep and a paintbrush. The mayor surrendered anyway. April 12, 1945. President Roosevelt dies. The news hits the unit via their own radios. The SCR-299 radio truck was a mobile broadcasting station. It had a range of 100 miles. Usually, they broadcast fake orders. That night, they broadcast the news. The spoof operators broke protocol. They tapped out "FDR dead" in clear text. The German listeners heard it. For one night, the deception stopped. Both sides listened to the same truth. The final major operation. Operation Viersen was the masterpiece, but the final days were the cleanup. The 23rd was used to project strength where there was none, to prevent German counterattacks on supply lines. They were the scarecrows. The ratio of deception changed. Instead of one man faking 30, it was one man faking 100. They deployed 400 dummy vehicles along a 20-mile stretch. It was a thin rubber line. The danger of the werewolves, the Nazi partisan movement. These were die-hard fanatics operating behind Allied lines. They didn't care about strategy. They cared about killing Americans. An inflatable tank doesn't stop a Panzerfaust. The 23rd had to increase their perimeter security. The 406th Combat Engineers mounted twin .50 calibers on their half-tracks. They stopped pretending. If a bush moved, they fired. The artists started carrying Thompson submachine guns. May 8, 1945, VE Day. The war in Europe ends. The 23rd is near Trier. The guns stop. The compressors turn off. The silence is deafening. For the first time in a year, there is no hum of the generator, no hiss of escaping air. But there is no parade. There is no newsreel coverage. The 101st Airborne gets the glory. The 23rd gets a memo. Classified top secret. The logic of the secrecy was cold. The war with Germany was over. The war with Russia was looming. The Pentagon realized that tactical deception was a force multiplier. If the Soviets knew the US had a dedicated ghost army, they would train to spot it. They would learn to look for the lack of heat signatures. They would learn to listen for the wire loop. To protect the weapon for the next war, the weapon had to be erased from history. The disbanding. July 1945. The unit is broken up. The men are sent home. They are given strict orders. You were in the engineers. You did camouflage. If they asked about the tanks, the answer was, "What tanks?" The records were crated up. 200 pounds of documents, photos, maps, sonic scripts. They were shipped to the Pentagon and stamped with a red secret. They were buried in the archives. If you want to support the preservation of military history and keep these stories alive, hit the like button. The algorithm buries history just like the Pentagon did. Subscribe for more deep dives. Back to the ghosts. The men return to civilian life. They are bursting with the best war stories of the century, and they can't tell a soul. The artists go back to art. This is the strangest part of the legacy. The men of the 603rd infiltrated American culture. Bill Blass. He was a master of camouflage in the 603rd. He returned to New York and became a fashion icon. He designed dresses for first ladies. He used color and structure to deceive the eye, to make a waist look smaller. He used the skills he learned painting fake tanks to define American fashion. Ellsworth Kelly. He served in the 603rd. He became one of the most important abstract painters of the 20th century. His style was hard-edge painting, bold blocks of color, sharp lines. Critics analyzed his work for decades. They talked about form and space. They didn't know he spent 1944 staring at camouflage patterns, learning how shadows break up a solid object. The Army taught him how to see. Art Kane, another ghost. He became a photographer. He took the famous "A Great Day in Harlem" photo. Arthur Singer. He became a world-renowned wildlife artist. His illustrations of birds are in every library in America. These men shaped the visual aesthetic of post-war America. And they all shared the same secret. They met at reunions, drank cheap beer, and laughed about the time they inflated a tank in a French pasture. But outside that room, they were silent. The Cold War impact. The Army didn't just hide the story, they studied it. The Ghost Army doctrine became the foundation for U.S. PSYOPs, psychological operations. The sonic deception evolved. Instead of wire recorders, they used tape. Then digital. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. used wandering soul tapes, spooky voices played from helicopters to terrify the Viet Cong. That tactic started with the 30th Signal Company in 1993. The technology of the decoy evolved. In the 1950s, the Army developed heat-generating decoys to fool infrared cameras. In the 1980s, they developed radar-reflective decoys to fool Soviet MiGs. The inflatable tank didn't die. It got a PhD in physics. The M1 Abrams decoy used today weighs 400 pounds and has a thermal generator that mimics the exhaust heat of a turbine engine. It costs $3,000. A real Abrams costs $6 million. The math still works. The declassification. 50 years later. The Pentagon finally released the files. The Ghost Army was no longer a secret. A freelance journalist found the crate. The story broke. The families of the veterans were stunned. Children who were now in their 50s looked at their fathers differently. You didn't fix trucks? You faked entire battles? The narrative of their lives was rewritten overnight. The reunion. The survivors were old men now. They gathered to see the declassified photos. They saw pictures of themselves standing next to rubber tanks. The validation was overwhelming. For 50 years, they felt like they had played at war. Now, history confirmed they had fought it. They had been in the crosshairs. The casualty lists were public. 3 members of the 23rd were killed in action. 30 wounded. They bled red blood, not rubber. The preservation of the artifact. Very few of the original inflatable tanks survived. They were rubber and canvas. They rotted. They were scrapped. Only a handful exist in museums. The National Museum of the United States Army has one. It is displayed in a glass case, climate-controlled. It looks comical. It looks like a pool toy. But when you look at the rivets, you see the artistry. They painted rust on the rubber to make it look used. The sonic legacy. The wire recordings were digitized. You can listen to them. Today, the sound of the ghost 6th Armored Division. It is eerie. You hear the clanking of treads that never existed. You hear voices shouting commands to soldiers who weren't there. It is a sonic snapshot of a lie. It is forensic proof of the 30th genius, the Congressional Gold Medal. It took another 25 years of lobbying. In 2022, President Biden signed the bill awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. It is the highest civilian honor in the United States. By then, only 9 members of the unit were still alive. They were in their late 90s. They watched the ceremony on Zoom. One of the survivors, Seymour Nussenbaum, was asked how he felt. He didn't use words like hero. He said, "It was a job. We did what we were told. We made things." That is the forensic reality. They were tradesmen. Their trade was deception. They didn't see themselves as James Bond. They saw themselves as carpenters and painters. The comparative analysis. Look at the modern battlefield. Ukraine, 2024. Decoys are back. Inflatable HIMARS launchers. Wooden mocked-up tanks. The Russians waste $1 million Iskander missiles hitting plywood targets. The tactics of the Ghost Army are more relevant today than they were in 1945. Drone warfare relies on visuals. If you can fool the drone, you survive. The 603rd wrote the textbook that the Ukrainian army is reading right now. The Mockery Revisited. Remember the generals who laughed? The ones who called it the Balloon Squad? History has forgotten their names, but the 23rd is remembered. The lesson is brutal. In war, the rigid mind loses. The creative mind wins. The generals wanted more armor. The 23rd gave them more imagination. The boss fight wasn't against the Germans. It was against the concept of reality. The 23rd proved that on the battlefield, reality is negotiable. If you can control what the enemy sees and hears, you control what he does. They hacked the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act of the German High Command. They fed false data into the observe phase, causing the act phase to be a disaster. The specific numbers of their impact. The U.S. Army Center of Military History estimates the 23rd saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. That is 2 full infantry divisions. 2 divisions of men who went home, had children, and built the baby boom generation because a jagged line of rubber tanks drew the fire away from them. The darker side. We must acknowledge it. The 23rd drew fire. That means they drew fire towards themselves, but also towards the French and Belgian towns they occupied. When the Germans shelled a ghost position, they were shelling real houses. Real civilians died because the 23rd set up a circus in their backyard. The morality of deception is complex. To save the army, you might sacrifice the village. The technical details of the flash canister one last time. It used 4 ounces of black powder. It was triggered by an electric squib. The timing had to be accurate to within 1/10 of a second. If it was late, the illusion failed. The men who operated these were sitting on top of explosives, waiting for a signal, while German artillery hunted them. That is not art. That is courage. The final inventory. When the unit disbanded, they turned in 400 inflatable tanks, M4-4, 150 inflatable aircraft, L4 P-47, 2 heavy wreckers, 6 bulldozers, 12,000 gallons of paint, and 0 heavy guns. They had fought the Wehrmacht with air and paint. The psychological toll on the deceivers. Post-war interviews hint at a strange dissonance. These men spent a year lying. When they came home, they had trouble trusting what they saw. They analyzed shadows. They looked for seams in the reality around them. It is a specific type of PTSD, the paranoia of the professional liar. Legacy and intelligence. The CIA recruited heavily from the 23rd veterans, not for their combat skills, but for their ability to construct a narrative. The art of the cover story is identical to the art of the ghost army. You build a shell that looks real from the outside. The 23rd was the incubator for Cold War spycraft, the ghost patch. It is rare, a triangle with a golden phoenix rising from flames. It was unauthorized during the war. They weren't allowed to wear it. They had to wear the patches of the units they faked. Today, an original Ghost Army patch sells for $3,000 on the collector's market. It is a symbol of the unit that didn't exist. The preservation of the dummy. In 2018, a French farmer found a deflated, rotted piece of rubber in his barn. It was a piece of a Ghost Army tank left behind in 1944. He donated it to a museum. It was analyzed chemically. The rubber was synthetic. Neoprene, a shortage material in 1944. The U.S. government prioritized rubber for fake tanks over tires for real trucks. That shows the strategic value of the lie. The final movement. Let's go back to the museum. The inflatable tank sits there. It is silent. But if you listen closely to the history, you can hear the 500-watt speakers blasting the sound of a bridge being built. You can hear the generator humming. You can hear the artist cursing as he patches a leak in the rain. This story is not about balloons. It is about the force multiplier. It is about how 1,000 men can do the work of 30,000. It is a lesson in leverage. The 23rd found the leverage point in the German mind, fear of the flank, and pressed it until it broke. The question remains, could it work today? Satellites see everything. Thermal cameras see heat. Radar sees metal. But the human brain is still the same. We still believe what we expect to see. The technology changes, but the psychology is static. The Ghost Army proved that the most vulnerable part of a tank is the commander's brain. If the Ghost Army hadn't existed, the Rhine crossing at Wesel would have been a bloodbath. The Ninth Army would have faced the full weight of the German reserves. The war might have dragged on for another month. Another month of camps. Another month of death. The Rubber Army bought time. And time is the most expensive commodity in war. So next time you see a military parade with massive tanks and missiles, ask yourself, is it real? Or is it just air? The 23rd taught us that it doesn't matter. If the enemy runs away, the tank is real enough. The ultimate vindication is the silence. The fact that you didn't know this story until 1996 is the proof of their success. They were so good at deception that they deceived their own country for half a century. They were the ultimate ghosts. Scriptwriter note: slow fade on the visual of the unit patch. The motto of the 23rd was not official, but they had a saying: we deceive to save. It wasn't about trickery for the sake of trickery. It was about saving the guys in the 101st. Saving the guys in the 2nd Armored. Every fake track in the mud was a life policy for a rifleman. The final technical spec, the M4 inflatable decoy. Weight, 93 tons. Inflation time, 20 minutes. Armor, 0 mm. Caliber, air. Kills, 0. Lives, saved, 30,000 meters. That is the only stat line that matters. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. This channel relies on viewers like you to help us uncover these forensic details. If you enjoyed the technical breakdown of the rubber army, check out our video on the bat bomb, another crazy experiment that actually worked. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. It helps the algorithm find us. And remember, history is written by the victors, but it's often made by the liars.